All right, folks, we are gearing up for round two in our summer series here, our first step on our Get Centered for the season. I'm going to talk about a portion of our development when we were discussing what to explore through this process. I immediately went to our early childhood development, certainly as it relates to our second half of life, something that Jung articulated really well, first half of life and second half of life. And I want to look at a couple of slides as we go. And this first slide is delineating the structure and dynamics of the psyche. And what Jung did, certainly that Freud did, but what Jung did is broke the psyche into three different levels. There's consciousness, the personal unconscious, and the collective unconscious. And throughout our lives, certainly throughout the first half of life, we are developing a self. And the self is in relationship to the culture or to the collective or to the environment. And at first, a lot of psychoanalytic theories talk about this fusion of the individual with the environment because there is no self, not in the Buddhist sense of no self, but there's no formed ego. And so what Jung was really articulating is that through this process of development that involves our biology, our psychology, our emotions, our interpersonal life, and these archetypes that he talked about. Now, in this structure of the psyche, the contents of consciousness is the ego. This is this storied narrative of who I am. It's the organ of orientation. The personal unconscious is full of what he called complexes that are these feeling-toned, historically based splinter personalities that manifest when we are, quote, triggered, or we're just living out some agenda. The collective unconscious is full of what he called the archetypes. These are powers and forces that are seemingly outside of human consciousness, yet human consciousness is beholden to these various patterns. This is what, in the Greek pantheon, for example, the archetypes are populating the pantheon. These are eternal forces that we're beholden to, and they take a certain form. For example, we all need to be mothered or fathered. That doesn't mean we have to have a mother and a father, but we have these energy fields that are represented in our lives. And if we don't have those energy fields represented, we will search it in some kind of other container. So what Jung, I want to jump here now into this image that I've talked about before, which is this path of individuation. So looking through the stages of development, you have a first half of life. Leila Scott mentioned it earlier. We have the adaptation to outer conditions. It's achievement-based, and we're essentially oriented to forming our sense of identity, who we are in the world. And as Leila Scott said, something I really liked, which was each stage prepares you for the next stage. And so if I don't have a healthy container of an identity of who I am in my first stage of life, the second half of life is going to be pretty difficult. So we don't need to go into it, but you can imagine, of course, what happens in the second half of life when we don't have a solid identity from the first. As we're transitioning from this formation period, there's typically some kind of a disturbance in the force. There's a crisis, there's a destabilizing experience, and it rocks the boat of those adaptations. And in the best of times, what it does is it shakes loose authentic parts of the individual that had to be sacrificed in order to assimilate to an environment that probably had ideas of who it wanted you to be more than who you wanted to be. And that's going to create an enormous conflict. Back to Jung, you might not be conscious of the conflict, but you will see it in various symptoms that manifest on the biological, psychological, social, and spiritual level. And of course, the second half of life, which we won't get into totally today, but just quickly, what happens in the second half of life is we have an adaptation to inner conditions and values. We begin to recollect fragments of our past that we had to drop. You may find somebody who's all of a sudden singing when they had to drop that, or being an artist because the family system said, "Oh, no, do that. You can't make any money." But now you're 50 and you're just all you want to do is paint or dance. The identity is resituated in relationship to this deeper part of self. And there's some recognition about how you've been taken for a ride that wasn't really authentically based in your own desires and needs. What Jeff Kripal does, he's a friend, he's a religious scholar. He says the human being is two. And if you'll look at this slide, what you see are three icons from three different religious traditions. The Star of David, what you'll see are two triangles that are interwoven together, and there's a tension inherent in the dual dynamic. There's a cross, which is an intersection point between two vectors. Then there's the yin and the yang, which is, of course, a tension held between two opposites. And what I like about the yin and the yang, of course, is that there's a little bit of each and the other. I think that is probably one of the most beautiful and profoundly powerful symbols that we might have. Jeff says each human being is two. That is, each person is simultaneously a conscious, constructed self or socialized ego, and a much larger, complexly conscious field that normally manifests only in non-ordinary states of consciousness and energy, which the religion traditions have historically objectified, mythologized, and projected outward into the sky as divine or as God, or introjected inward into the human being as nirvana, Brahman, or located in some sort of experienced paradoxical state that is neither inside or outside, as in the Chinese Tao or the American paranormal. So what Jeff starts to understand is to look at is that what we don't consciously own in ourselves is projected outside of ourselves, and will be in relationship to it out there in the form of maybe a hero, in the form of a lover, in the form of an idealized other figure, in the form of an institution. And we'll take all those parts of ourselves that we don't realize. This is not an intellectual knowing. This is, we don't embody the fact that that is in fact our life. So it's projected out into the world. So essentially, this is Joseph Campbell's model of the psyche, which I think does a really good job of looking at these layers of consciousness. And if you'll notice, the top level is looking at the idea of transcendence. The arched figure is the sun door. There's nature or moral laws. The temple represents the institutionalization of morality and social customs, and the people represent the neighbors, like what will the neighbors think? So that's our world. That's our environment that's pushing on our identity and forming us. And it needs to happen. It doesn't need to be vilified. This is natural nature. And there's a cost. And the cost, as this image really identifies, is that all those unconscious aspects are then related with in nature, animals, others. So the quote from Jung that I love very much is, when it comes to being in relationship with this cycle or process of adaptation, I quoted this from Jung, volume 18, paragraph 1087 and 1089. In neurosis, the adaptation process is disturbed, or rather we might say that the neurosis itself is a disturbed or diminished process of adaptation that takes two basic forms. One, the disturbance of adaptation to the outer conditions, or two, the disturbance of adaptation to the inner conditions. Similarly, we also need to look at two different and fundamental situations, right? The adaptation to the outer condition is disturbed because the subject tries to adapt entirely and exclusively to the outside, while entirely neglecting the inside, thereby upsetting the balance of the act of adaptation. Two, the disturbance arises from a preferential adaptation to the inside. Equally, adaptations to the inner conditions can be disturbed in two ways: by an exclusive adaptation to the outside, or by neglect of the outside in favor of the adaptation to the inside. So this is important because we start to differentiate the nature, of our human nature. And what we can do is look at our early development and healthy development and recognize that, number one, we aren't all raised perfectly. And in fact, one thing that Jung said that I love very much was that I don't wish the perfect parent on anybody. In fact, we're going to be wounded based upon the dynamics, right? We all carry various wounds. And so unfortunately, it's not, are you affecting your child? It's, how are you? Because you definitely are. The point is to be conscious of how those various adaptations affected your development, affected that first half of life, and formed the idea, right? Again, because the ego is a story creating organ, affected the idea of who you know yourself to be, which then affects your perceptions and your behaviors and your mental formations. And you live those out as if they are reality. But one thing we do know about reality is reality isn't reality. Reality is your understanding of reality based upon your history. So what happens in our first half of life is this form, is this idea. Now we're in summer, so we're going to talk about how this is formed, right? We're not going into not necessarily going fully into the second half of life. We'll do this in later series, but first and foremost, we need to look at and identify the ways in which our idea of who we are is created in our first half of life relative to our biological, social, emotional, and spiritual upbringing. And then we can get little indicators on how those formations might not be totally aligned with the real essence of who we are, which we would call soul. And I do want to define that for a second from Thomas More. Soul is the invisible, mysterious, and softly radiant element that infuses your being and makes you human. Like plasma in your veins, it gives you a sense of meaning, feeling, connection, and depth. And a lot of times, what we treat are folks who feel stale or stagnant. You know, Leela Scott talked about fire, and I'll finish just after this thought. Leela Scott talked about fire, and of course, a lot of the Christian formations of hell involve hell being this fiery pit. And Henri Corbin, this writer of religion, he writes, I think, very beautifully. He says, hell is not fire. Fire is transformative. Hell is frozen. It's when we become fixed. It's when we become stuck. And one of the most common things for the psychotherapist, at least in my office, that most people feel stuck. They've tried all kinds of approaches. They've tried everything from sex, drugs, and rock and roll to wellness and reading and swimming and exercise, but they keep doing what they've always done. The act of therapy involves a deep reflective experience with another human being in a context of trust, to begin to help articulate who it is you truly are as your soul is speaking. And so the fire piece is, we got to go out there, we got to form our space, we got to achieve. But just like with the sun, Leela Scott says this a lot, the sun casts a shadow. So something's left out. And part of our work is about reclaiming what is left out in the process. And I'll leave it there for right now.
I'm curious what the conflicts are. I'm curious, like, what are the inward, outward conflicts that can arise as a result of this kind of shaking loose process that you talked about, and coming back to, you know, identifying the parts of you that you may have sacrificed or left behind in this youth phase?
It's a great question. So I tend to really like the model of one of my, I think, central academic, scholarly, and spiritual perspectives, as Ariel, as you and I discussed from our first date, is that there is a biological, psychological, social, and spiritual aspect to reality. So anytime we want to look at conflicts, we want to pay attention to those various areas. And when somebody comes in, I'm really listening to what's in the foreground. And I'm beginning to hold what's in the background too. I'm beginning to theorize what might be going on back here. And that's when I start doing the work of interpretation, because I'm trying to draw their attention to these patterns that, just by the nature of our consciousness, they're not aware of. I mean, let's just think physiologically. I'm not aware of my heartbeat right now until I say it. Now I am. Now you are, right? I'm not aware of the seat on my ass or my ass on my seat. Now I am. Now you are. That's a decent indicator of what is conscious or unconscious, or just beneath consciousness. So when somebody comes in, I'm paying attention to, the crudest answer, I think, is just listening to outer world, inner world. Is it a pattern in their relationships? Is it a pattern in their history? Is it a pattern of the way in which they're thinking and perceiving their reality? Of course, all these things are interwoven, right? There's no real way that we can separate a person's biology from their spirituality. We think we can, but we can't. Things get really fucked up when we start doing that. So what we want to do is listen for how we get the entry point. And most commonly, I would say the conflicts are some kind of family system issue. They have some kind of surrogate that they're seeking in the form of addiction or the form of relationships. There are patterns of thinking. What I encounter a lot of times when I push on somebody a little bit is they'll start kind of just calling out, like, I don't think I can do that, and then it's like, well, let's look at that belief pattern, because we have these unconscious limiting beliefs that influence how we see the world. And I love William Blake for this one, because William Blake says, I see through the eye and not with it. But oftentimes we see with our eye. We believe that our perception is the world, and it's not. We can look at it, and that's the point of, I think, the relational dynamic in psychotherapy, is that you're able to totally expose yourself and mine through the contents, because most of the time you're regulating, you're socially monitoring, you're being tense. Am I liked? Do you like me? Am I looking like I'm this, that, or the other? Do I look confident? Do I look cool? Do I look effective? Do I look valuable? Am I a person who is of potency? That's the kind of shit that we're talking about all the time. And so what I recommend for people is to not edit. And if you can come in and actually take me up on that it's a pretty radical experience to be with another person and unedited. And then you really get to look at some of those things that you tend to repress and suppress most of the time. I hope that got to your question, Ariel.
Yeah, I guess I was curious in terms of the family systems. What does it shake loose when somebody starts to individuate? You know, as the person who's doing it, I'm talking about myself a little bit, but it's like, you know, as you start to be yourself, the systems around you sort of go,
Like get
whoa,
pissy. Yeah.
hey, what are you doing over here?
Yeah. I know
What's
you,
with the
you're not doing the thing that we agreed.
what's with the beard? Or you know, you
It always comes down to the beard, man.
just like in terms of just expecting that in some way is already some of the healing. Just to know, okay, I'm changing. This may be bring stuff up for other people who assume I'm going to be a certain way. It seems
Right.
like there's a wisdom in that, just knowing it.
Yeah, there is. And I do, Jim Hollis has a great quote about how the family system or the institution is consistently asking the individual to make sacrifices of their soul, because what it seeks is compliance and obedience and identification with the collective norm. And what we're talking about is a process of not only being in collectivity, but paradoxically also being an individual. And that sets up a really difficult structure for us, because in a dualistic dynamic, which we're totally in, it's very difficult to walk the line of paradox and ambiguity. And so we're kind of called, there's an old Zen saying that says, if it's not paradox, it's not true. And so trying to actually put yourself in a state of holding the opposites and holding the paradox. I am both an individual and I am collective. I am both biological and I am spiritual. I am both an ant that is just trying to like grow my colony, and I'm also divine, and I'm trying to connect deeply and express my soul. You know, and that I think is what's socialized out of us a bit. And Aldous Huxley talked about the major problem of that is overpopulation. You know, because the more we get overpopulated, and then the more the culture pushes upon us to be a certain way.
I want to chime in just for a little bit and just think about how it's sort of in us naturally that we know on some level that first half of life is about taking. You know, we've been given life force, right? The egg and the sperm came together and created a new life. And we know it's like when we're in the womb, we're taking from mom, right? And then we're taking from life. We're accumulating. And sometimes we take things that we weren't maybe supposed to take because we're confused, right? We don't have a lot of orientation around this. Our parents didn't know the things that we have charged ourselves with learning, right? Like we're all here trying to, on some level, drop what didn't work in the generations before so that we don't pass them to the next generation. But when you are a little one and you're just programmed to take everything around you, you're taking what's good, but you're also taking what doesn't work. Right. And I'm thinking of this also simultaneously, John, you alluded to it, that like the sun casts a shadow. And we've said it before, how sort of the perfect, other than the Tai Chi symbol, that the perfect yin yang imagery is a mountain, and the sun is shining on one side of the mountain. So this is lit up and this is in the darkness still. But we also have to relate it to that there's an uphill climb and then there's a descent. So there's this combination of accumulating, climbing, effort, right? And then you get to the top and go, oh my God, I don't know that I want half the stuff that I've gotten, whether it's a belief system or a habit or a title or whatever, a relationship, you know, and then you start walking down that mountain, shedding the stuff. And hopefully, right, like we need assistance. We need people like what we do, right? People who are trained in these kinds of awarenesses to help each other, initiate each other into the second half of life, and to begin that descent. And like you said, people around us don't love it if they're not doing it too.
Yeah, and we have a lot of if I had more time, I would have really gone into shadow a lot more. And I think G and I were talking about, you know, the hate crimes that are happening, but certainly, I mean, just collectively, and what that is I mean, just to be reductive for a second, because it's a total reduction. I know it's more complex than this, but on some level, what happens is that somebody's otherness which is essentially a way of saying somebody's different. We're so invested in doubling down on our own understanding of reality because the ego is destabilized when its familiarity is poked at. So if I have one of those weakened egos from my first half of life and I see an other, and it enrages me because I'm not content in me. I'm not content in my own identity, that just the existence of an other is a repository for all of that unconscious insecurity, violence and aggression, a sense of being scared in the world because I don't have a strong base. That's projected out into the world of the other. And then the fantasy that violence to an other will somehow satisfy what is destabilized. But as we all know, that doesn't work. So this dynamic it's very important in our first half of life to experience love, connection, reflection, attunement, space, solitude, right? Excitement and enthusiasm for you, for who you are and who you're becoming. And if we don't experience that, our container is shaky. And the fact of the matter is, we're not able to go, oh, my container's shaky, because my favorite image for this one is the fish that's in water that jumps out of the water, looks down and says, oh, that's what that stuff is. It doesn't know it until it gets out of itself. But if you are so invested in sameness, you never get to see out of your waters. And so what you do is perpetuate your desire to have other people look like you, other people behave like you, other people do what you do, because your difference makes that individual's ego very uncomfortable. And so I think sometimes I can get on a soapbox here, but I think it's very important for us to look at this, because what we're seeing in the polarity, in the politicization of our political landscape and our collective, of the religious issues, of the racial issues, of the sexuality issues, I mean, just name it. What we're seeing is a faulty ground, a faulty identity of people who have been connected with to feel content in who they are and in their own soul, erupting out and imagining that you need to take out that sense of insecurity on the representation of your inner lack. You project that onto somebody that represents where you lack, what you may not even know you lack. This is a typical dynamic where you see somebody who's totally homophobic that enacts some kind of violence on gay people, where usually when we look at somebody that's doing this, it's like they're absolutely disconnected from their own emotional life, from their own feeling center, from their own sense of intimacy and how they get and receive intimacy and connection. Okay, well, there's more to come here on this one. Thanks for being here. Round 2 on Get Centered, where we talk about first half of life and summer, and certainly check out Gia, who's coming up next, going to talk about play.